Welcome back, friends. In the quiet of tonight, we're heading back, but not to knights and noble quests. No crowns, no dragons, just the raw edge of the Middle Ages, where history whispers instead of roars. We're talking about the ones history tends to forget, the medieval peasants. They didn't ride into battle or pose for tapestries. They endured plagues, hunger, bitter winters, and the daily grind of survival with no applause, no titles, no grand monuments, just calloused hands and quiet endurance, a strength so quiet, most of us wouldn't last a single sunrise in their shoes. If stories like this slow your mind and soften the world a bit, you're welcome to like the video and subscribe, only if it genuinely gives you peace. And hey, drop a comment, tell me where you're tuning in from and what time it is right now. There's something oddly beautiful about knowing we're all out here, drifting off to the same quiet tale. This video is 2 hours long. Hope you enjoy it and let it calm your mind. Get cozy, let your body rest. And now, let's take a slow walk to the edge of the map, where the world feels a little softer and the noise fades away. In this quiet place, there's a village without a name. Maybe it once had one, but no one remembers. It sits in a shallow valley, far from any roads or towns. So far that even the king's messengers never come this way. You wouldn't find it on a map. Not that you've ever seen one. Out here, the map just ends. The trees begin, and beyond them, the rest of the world is forgotten. The forest nearby feels old, like it's been around forever, and it's only just allowing you to stay. The fields are scattered patches of green and brown, tired from years of farming. And somewhere far to the north, there's a river. You've never seen it, but people speak of it like a fairy tale. This is where you were born. This is where you'll live. And one day, where you'll rest forever. You might walk only 60 steps between the two. The homes here are small and slouching, like they've bent beneath the wind for too many winters. The walls are made of mud and straw, held together with sticks and patched up with whatever people can find. The roofs are thick with straw too, always a little damp, always leaking somewhere. The village smells like earth after rain, like smoke from the fire, like wet wool and a bit of old animals. Nothing bad really, just real. It's the smell of life here. There's no real road. Just 2 muddy tracks from old cart wheels, full of puddles and buzzing bugs. Important people don't come here. Maybe they never did. Most days pass quietly. Now and then, if the wind is just right, you'll hear a bell ringing from a church far away. But mostly, you tell time by the sun, or the shade in the fields, or the ache in your back before lunch. There are about a dozen families in the village, enough for a small feast on holidays. Everyone knows each other. Everyone knows each other's troubles too, but no one talks about them unless they have to. The closest thing to a leader is old Tom. He once talked to a traveling monk, and now he tells that story like it makes him wise. No one argues. Tom's roof doesn't leak, and his goat looks healthy. That's good enough for most people. Nothing here is written down. There are no maps, no documents. People say, "It's mine up to that big tree," or "Stop digging when the ground feels soft." If there's a disagreement, it's sorted out with a few words, and maybe a loaf of bread passed back and forth until no one wants to argue anymore. There's no school, no inn, no pub. If a stranger ever shows up, people talk about it for weeks. Where are they from? What do they want? Do they smell like the sea? Are they unlucky? And nobody really leaves. Not for long anyway. travel isn't really something people do here. It's more like a rumor, something you hear about in stories. They say there are places with tall stone buildings 2 or even 3 stories high, places where the streets are always full and the food tastes like spice and smoke. But to you, those places sound more like fairy tales, like animals that speak, or women who turn into birds. You can't miss a world you've never seen. And out here, the forest is thick. The hills roll on and on. If there are roads, they're known more for danger than for any promise of where they might lead. Bandits, broken wagons, bad weather. And even if you got there, wherever there is, what would you do? You don't know the language. You don't carry coins. You don't know the rules or how to act. You don't even know how old you are. So you stay. Because staying is safe. Even if it's boring. Even if the roof leaks. Even if the stew in the pot has been the same for 3 days now. There's still a kind of comfort in it all. You know where the firewood is stacked. You know who to ask when your fence falls. You know which slice of sky will tell you it's time to bring the sheep home. You wake with the sun. You sleep when it disappears. And in between you work. It's not much, but it's life. And in the slow, steady rhythm of it all, there's a quiet kind of peace. A peace that doesn't need answers. That doesn't reach further than what you can see from the top of the nearest hill. Sometimes you hear about things, a war, a king who died, a comet that frightened people in a village 5 days from here, but news like that never really touches you. By the time it reaches your ears, it's more whisper than truth. Even time feels different here. Seasons slide into each other without clear lines. Spring stays damp and becomes summer before you notice. A frost turns into a biting winter that ruins boots and splits wood. You don't count years. You count harvests, dry ones, wet ones. The bad year when the rye went black with mold. The good year when the barley came in fat and golden, and even old Marjorie laughed like she used to. Once in a while, a steward comes through. He writes things down. He asks questions. You answer carefully. Not too much detail. He doesn't like detail. You've never met the king. You're not really sure what he does. But you know his name and you say it when you pray. Just in case. Because here, at the edge of the map, most things stay the same. And when they change, it's usually not for the better. Still, the fire glows. The roof mostly holds. The stew is warm. And tomorrow the sun will rise over the same quiet hills. You'll walk many miles in your life, but most of them will be in circles. Most people here never travel far from where they were born, not because they don't wander, not because they're lazy, and not even because they lack boots, though boots are precious, but because the world beyond the next hill never felt like theirs. It didn't call to them, not really. So instead, you learn the names of every little spot between your home and the edge of the field. You know the shape of every tree stump on the walk to the well. You can guess who's passed down the path just by their footprints in the mud. And anything beyond that feels like a dream someone else had. You'd heard stories now and then about who got married, who stole a goat, who whispered that the priest snored during Mass. But those were just stories. You hadn't seen it for yourself. And truthfully, you probably never would. Because travel wasn't exciting. Not like in the tales. It was hard, quiet, lonely. And sometimes, it could even be deadly. The roads weren't really roads. Just narrow, muddy paths through deep forests and wide, silent fields. There were no signs, no maps. No inns with warm fires waiting. Only vague directions like, walk until you find the leaning pine, then turn at the rock shaped like a sleeping pig. And the path was full of worries. First, the forest. Real forests weren't friendly. They were thick and dark, filled with twisted roots and strange sounds. Boars crashing through the underbrush. Wolves howling in the distance. People hiding in the shadows. people who didn't want to be found. If you weren't born in the woods, they made it clear. You didn't belong there. Then there were the bandits. Desperate people with nothing to lose. A traveler walking alone was easy to spot, and if you looked well-fed or walked like you had a plan, you might as well have painted a target on your back. Confidence didn't protect you. And of course, getting lost. That was the most frightening thing of all. This wasn't the kind of lost where someone would come looking. If you took a wrong turn, there might be no one for miles. You couldn't follow a river and hope it led to a town. You could vanish into the trees like smoke, and no one would notice until days later, if ever. Even the simple things became problems. If you left home, who would feed your animals? Who would tend the fields? What if the steward came to collect taxes while you were away? Curiosity wasn't an excuse he'd care about. Work didn't stop just because you wanted to see what was beyond the hills, and if you did make it to another village, what then? You weren't expected. You weren't always welcome. Outsiders brought trouble, illness, strange habits, different words and ways of doing things. Even how you held a spoon could make people uneasy. Some might be kind, but most would be cautious. Food was tight, beds were full, people looked after their own first. Home wasn't perfect, but it was known. You understood the small things. Which part of the roof always leaked, which chickens liked to sneak off, which neighbor might lend you a hammer if you asked just right. Out there, no one owed you anything. Still, people did travel. Not peasants usually, but monks, merchants, messengers, people with purpose, or gods, or both. You might see them once or twice a year, rolling through with wagons full of wool, salted fish, and rumors. They spoke of faraway cities with stone towers and streets that didn't turn to mud when it rained, of shops that sold spices you'd never tasted, of crowds and cathedrals and candles that never blew out. It sounded like another world, one worth listening to, but you didn't dream too hard, because the fire still burned at home. The roof still mostly held, and tomorrow would come just like today, with the same sky, the same field, the same path to the well. And for now, that was enough. Even if the stories were true, what would you do in a place like that? You couldn't read the signs. You had no money. You wouldn't know how to act, or what rules to follow. A big city could swallow you whole, and no one would even know your name. So you stayed, not because you were scared, though sometimes you were, but because you had things to care for, a fence to fix, a niece to watch, barley to dry, and a dozen other small jobs before the sun went down behind the trees. And honestly, you didn't need the world to be bigger than it was. The village was enough. It had stories, arguments, weather, sickness, laughter, and little joys. It had the sound of bells, the turning of seasons, and the quiet pride of making it through another day. Sometimes you dreamed about what was beyond the woods, but most days you just hoped the stew didn't burn while you fetched some water. Some people left. The bold ones, the desperate ones, sometimes the dreamers. A young man might go looking for work, for adventure, for a reason to keep walking. Maybe he'd come back with a limp. Maybe he'd come back with a tail. Or maybe he wouldn't come back at all. And if he didn't, people just nodded and said, "He went beyond the trees," as if that explained everything. Maybe it did. For those who stayed, life was small, but it was familiar. You weren't lonely. Not really. You had family, neighbors, animals, and the land. There was comfort in knowing what each day might bring. Comfort in simple things. A warm meal, a dry roof, the sound of someone's laugh across the yard. You didn't need faraway places to feel love, or sadness, or hope. And as time passed, and your bones ached more, and the children grew taller than the fence, the idea of leaving faded. Not with sadness, just with understanding. Some people are meant to travel. You were meant to stay. Your home wasn't perfect. It wasn't shiny or new. There was no plan, no fancy tools, no perfect pieces waiting to fit together. Just mud, wood, and whatever you could find. You started with the frame, wood from nearby trees, cut with old tools that had been used by many hands. The wood bent a little, so did your walls. But that was okay. Then came the weaving, thin sticks woven between posts. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't fast, but it worked. Next the daub, mud, straw, manure, and water. You slapped it on by hand. It dried slow, sometimes cracked, sometimes fell off. You patched it, again and again. You got used to the smell. Eventually you stopped noticing it. The roof was thatch, dry straw tied down tight. At first, it looked golden, almost lovely. But then the rain came, then birds, then time. The color faded. The holes showed up. You patched it, again and again. Sometimes you thought it might be easier to live under a cart. The floor was dirt. You told yourself it was firm. Kind of. Years of walking and sweeping made it solid enough, until it rained. Or froze. Or the goats came in. You spread straw on it. It helped. A little. Then the straw got dirty, got damp, turned to dust. You swept it out. Or didn't. Eventually, it just became part of the floor. And the windows? Not really windows. Just holes with wooden shutters that didn't quite fit. No glass. Too expensive. Too breakable. So the wind came in. The cold, too. But still, it was home. You could hear the animals outside. And sometimes, they came inside, too. There was only one door. A little crooked from the last frost. It closed with a hook. Or maybe just a wooden peg. Not to keep thieves out. There wasn't anything worth stealing. But to stop the wind from coming in and the chickens from wandering out. Inside, everything was shared. One room, maybe two if someone had managed to build a little side shed or a loft above, but usually just one. One space for everything. Eating, sleeping, cooking, mending, talking, arguing, and hoping. Everyone lived here. Parents, children, maybe a cousin or two, a grandparent, and sometimes a neighbor's child if their parents were sick or gone. In the center, there was a hearth. If you were lucky, it was made of stone. If not, clay. The smoke rose through a hole in the roof, more or less. There was no chimney. The air inside was always smoky, a little warm, a little damp, and always smelled faintly of stew that had been reheated one too many times. There wasn't much furniture. A table, a bench, maybe a stool or a chest. If someone in your family could carve wood, or married someone who could. Beds were wooden frames stuffed with straw or feathers. Most were shared. Most squeaked. Blankets were heavy, rough wool, never quite dry. Food and herbs hung in the rafters. Garlic, onions, dried leaves, maybe even a little ham, if the pig had been generous that year. You could tell the season just by smelling the air above your head. Sometimes it made you feel safe. Sometimes it reminded you that your food was running low. Animals lived with you, not just outside, but in. A cow might sleep in the corner. Chickens, too. Maybe a goat. It wasn't clean, but it was warm. You learned to sleep through clucks, snorts, and the occasional loud bleat in the middle of the night. Their sounds became part of the background, like the wind in the thatch or the creaking of the walls. Nothing in the house was straight. The floor dipped, the roof slanted, the walls bulged a little, like they were breathing in and out with the seasons. You fixed what you could, you ignored what you couldn't. Every spring you promised to repair the back wall. Every autumn, it still leaned. It wasn't a house built to last forever, just a house meant to survive the next storm. But for all its flaws, it was home. You knew where the cold came in and how to block it with an old sack. You knew which beam you could hang the pot from and which one groaned when someone stepped too close. You knew where the light fell in the afternoon and where the dog liked to sleep. Strangers might walk in and see poverty. You saw effort. You saw cleverness. You saw survival. A roof that hadn't fallen was a win. A fire still burning in the morning was a gift. A dry corner was as valuable as gold. And at the end of the day, lying down in the warmth of snores and straw and smoke, you felt a strange kind of comfort. Not pride exactly, but a deep, steady peace. This was your place. It shifted, it creaked, it let in the wind, but it held, and so did you. Food wasn't special. It was a problem to solve, not colourful, not different, and often not very hot. Each day you faced the same challenge, trying to turn the same few ingredients into something filling, something warm, something edible. There was no real kitchen, just a corner near the hearth. No shelves lined with supplies, no neat rows of jars or herbs by the window, just a pot, a fire, and a short list of things you hoped hadn't gone bad. Most meals were pottage, a kind of never-ending stew that lived in the pot and was almost always cooking. It wasn't quite new, but it was never quite old. You just kept adding to it through the day. You stirred the pot at night. Not too fast, not too slow, just enough to keep it warm. You hoped nothing odd had started growing in it while you weren't looking. That was pottage, a stew that never really ended. What you put in depended on what you had, and usually that wasn't much. On a good day, there might be cabbage, leeks, barley, and a handful of beans or peas, maybe some garlic or an onion, if the harvest had been kind. In winter, you reached for the dried stuff, whatever had lasted. If you were lucky, a bit of salted pork went in. More often, it was just the bone, and even that was precious. You could boil a single bone for days, just hoping it would remember the taste of meat. The flavor, always the same, earthy, plain, almost more of a temperature than a taste. You didn't eat pottage because it was delicious. You ate it because it was warm, because it filled your belly, because it meant you'd made it through another day. Cleaning the pot wasn't really a thing. You wiped it, scraped it, but it never truly got clean. Each new meal carried a little memory of the last one. Yesterday's stew and today's spoon. No spice, no bright vinegar. Just a steady, dull flavor, a taste like boiled history. And then there was bread. Not the soft, golden kind from stories, but heavy, dark, and hard, made from rye or barley or oats, whatever poor people could grow. Wheat, the fine white kind, was for the rich. Your bread came in small, dense loaves that didn't rise much and crumbled fast. Leave one out for a day, and you could probably use it to hammer nails. But it did its job. It soaked up stew. It filled the gaps. In hard times, the flour ran low. People used whatever they could find. Chaff, crushed peas, even tree bark, the soft inside part. That became famine bread. Bitter, rough, and barely food. But it kept you going. On really poor days, people didn't even use plates. They cut old bread into slices and served stew right on top. Those slices were called trenches. You ate them if you were hungry enough, or handed them down to someone lower on the food chain. Even bread had a pecking order. Meat was rare. Eggs came from chickens. Milk came from cows. You didn't eat the animals unless you had no other choice. And when you did, you used everything. Meat, fat, bones, organs. Nothing went to waste. The blood made puddings. The fat was saved. The head became soup. Pigs were the most useful. Their fat gave food flavor. Salted pork could make even bland stew taste like something. But killing a pig was a big event. It meant careful planning, salting, hanging, storing, and hoping nothing spoiled. Fishing helped if you lived near water, but even that had rules. Many lakes and rivers were owned by lords. Fishing without permission could get you fined, or worse. Still, if you were quiet and lucky, you might catch an eel or a small fish. Salted herring was a treasure. If you got your hands on one, it meant a good day. The church also had rules. No meat on Fridays, no meat during Lent, so you had to adjust. People got creative. At one point, even beaver tails were called fish, a little trick to keep food on the table. Milk was useful, but it didn't last. You had to use it quickly, or turn it into something else. Cheese. Butter. Butter was rare and precious. Cheese was tangy and dry. If you had wheels of cheese tucked away, it meant your cow had been generous that year. Dairy was helpful, but not always kind to your stomach. And of course, there was no fridge. Only the weather, the cellar, and a bit of hope. Even when the milk went sour, you still used it. Butter turned rancid. Cheese grew mold. You didn't throw it out. You cut around the worst of it and hoped your stomach could handle the rest. That was just life. You got used to it. Drinks were simple. Water couldn't always be trusted. Not with the stream so low, or with careless neighbors upstream. So people drank ale, not strong ale, just small beer. Mild, cloudy, and homemade. Just enough alcohol to keep the bad things out and the thirst away. Everyone drank it, even the children. If you had apples, you might make cider. Pears too, now and then. But wine was for priests and noblemen. Mead was a dream. Milk was saved for the young, the sick, or the very old. Otherwise, it was ale for breakfast. Ale with dinner. Ale to help you sleep, and to soften the knowledge that tomorrow's taste would be the same. Vegetables filled most of the plate, though plates weren't always used. Cabbage, garlic, onions, turnips and leeks, carrots, but not orange. Those came later. Medieval carrots were pale purple or white. You grew what you could, and you used every bit. Turnip tops became boiled greens. Carrot leaves flavored stews. Even peels had purpose, burned for heat or buried for next year's soil. Fruit came when it came, apples mostly. Berries if you were lucky, or plums if the tree was generous. You dried what you could, ate the rest fast. There wasn't much preserving. Sugar was too expensive to dream about. Honey, if you had bees, was gold in a jar. Otherwise, things stayed savory, or at least not sweet. Herbs were grown in corners, parsley, mint, sage, dill. They weren't used to make food taste better, not on purpose. They were medicine. They kept flies away. They warded off illness, at least in stories. If they made the stew taste good, well, that was a bonus. Meals were shared, everyone on benches, around the hearth. No tablecloths, no courses. Just a pot, a hunk of bread, and the quiet hope there'd be something left tomorrow. You didn't complain. Complaining didn't make the pot fuller. On special days, weddings, saints' feasts, harvest, you might roast a chicken, or bake a pie, not a flaky golden one. A medieval pie was tough and thick, more box than crust. The dough was there to hold the filling, not to be eaten unless you were hungry, which you usually were. If spices were around, pepper, maybe ginger, a hint of cinnamon, someone had traded well, or gotten lucky, but most days weren't feast days. Most days were the same. You scraped your bowl, you dipped your bread, you drank your ale, and when you leaned back, warm and full enough to last the evening, it was enough. Not joy, but enough. There was a kind of comfort in knowing what came next, knowing how the stew would taste. knowing who would hand you the bowl, knowing how the fire crackled and where the breeze slipped in through the wall. The animals shifted, the pot kept bubbling, and once again you'd made it. Maybe not well, maybe not easy, but you'd made it. Even if you didn't own much, just a patch of land, a bent tool, a tired cow, and a house that leaned when the wind blew, you knew what you had. You built it yourself. You kept it upright. It was yours in practice, even if it wasn't yours on paper, because all of it, in name, belonged to the Lord, the one who lived up the hill. His house was a little straighter, a little warmer. His roof didn't leak. His bread rose higher. His stew had meat more often than not. He owned the land, which meant he owned everything on it, including, in a way, you. You were a villain, not a villain. That's just what it was called. A kind of peasant bound to the land. You couldn't leave without permission. You couldn't pass your land to your children freely. You worked, but the land and what it gave wasn't really yours. You weren't a slave, but you weren't free. You didn't deal with the Lord himself, not often. He had a steward for that, a man with lists and ledgers, and an eye for anyone behind on their dues. And there were always dues. Labor was the first thing you owed. A few days each week, maybe more at harvest, you worked not your own field, but his. They called it corvée labor. You got no coin, no thanks. Just the quiet fact that someone up the hill would eat bread baked from grain you helped reap. Then there were taxes, a portion of your grain, a bundle of wool, a clutch of eggs. If you brewed ale, he got some. If your pig grew fat, he got a slice. If you fished, the river was his. It didn't stop with food. If you wanted to grind grain, you paid to use his mill, even though it was the only mill, even though the prices were high. Trying to grind by hand could get you fined, or worse. Same with baking. Many villages had a shared oven. If you tried to bake at home and someone noticed, there'd be consequences. Because it wasn't just about taxes, it was about control. And then there were the fees. Want to marry? Pay a fee. Want to inherit your father's field? Fee. Move to another village? Ask permission, then pay. Even your livestock might be taxed. Your tools, your work. Even your right to stay in one place came with strings. And in return, what did you get? Well, in theory, protection. If bandits came, or war broke out, the Lord had men with swords. If the harvest failed, he might have grain to spare. If a neighbor's goat chewed through your garden, the Lord's court might settle it. For a price. That was feudalism. A great web of obligations. A ladder where each rung leaned on the one below. Loyalty flowed upward, labor and food followed. The language was about duty and honor, but underneath it was about land. Whoever owned it held power, and whoever didn't bent their back to someone who did. The manor house looked down on it all, maybe built of stone, maybe heavy timber, always bigger, always stronger. Its roof didn't flutter in the wind, its walls didn't bend with the seasons, it didn't need to. It was made to last. Inside the manor there were tapestries on the walls, long tables polished by time, and servants moving in and out like clock hands. And at the center of it all, your lord. He wore wool lined with fur. He sat down to meals you couldn't imagine, meats layered with spices, warm loaves made from white wheat, wine that didn't sour by morning. He didn't know your name, but he knew your numbers, how much barley you'd harvested, how many eggs you'd promised this season, whether your son had grown tall enough to be added to the labor rolls. Everything was tracked. Not by you couldn't read, but by the steward, the reeve, the bailiff, men with wax tablets or scraps of parchment, walking from house to house, asking questions you learned to answer carefully. If you didn't meet your quota, the consequences came. Fines, usually. More work, less time. Sometimes they took your tools, your grain, your goats. And in the worst of it, they could take your land, even your home. You didn't fight back. Not really. You didn't storm the manor. You bowed your head and waited for the storm to pass. Not because you were weak, but because the world didn't make space for rebellion. Not for people like you. And here's the strange part. It worked. Not because it was fair, not because it was kind, but because it was predictable. It had rules, even if they were heavy. You knew what was owed. You knew when to deliver. And now and then, the system gave something back. A feast day where food was handed out, a labor holiday after harvest, a smile from the saddle when the Lord rode past and tossed a coin to the children. Not enough to tip the scales, but enough to stop them from falling over. You didn't love your Lord, but you endured him. Because that was the rhythm of things. He might be young, old, cruel, generous, present or far away. It didn't matter. He was always above, always looking down. You tipped your cap. You said the right words, not because he deserved them, but because you deserved peace. And maybe, just maybe, you held onto a sliver of hope. That if you worked hard enough, kept quiet long enough, prayed loud enough, something might change. It almost never did, but hope, even faint, kept the wheel turning. So the steward walked, the reeve counted, the mill spun, and you kept digging, year after year, season after season. There was no retirement, no promotion, just the quiet knowledge that you'd made it through another year. You'd done what was asked, and for now that meant you could stay. Long before the Black Death crept through Europe and changed everything, illness was already part of daily life. Not sudden, not shocking, just always there. Fever, coughing, a sore that wouldn't heal, a bit of bad meat, a drop of dirty water. You didn't need a plague to fall ill. You only needed to be alive. There were no hospitals. Not really. If your village was lucky, it had a wise woman, maybe a midwife, who knew which leaves to boil and which ones not to touch. If you were very lucky, there might be a monk nearby, literate, calm, sometimes helpful. But most of the time, when you were sick, you stayed in bed and hoped. You sweated, you whispered prayers, and the fire kept burning. No one understood what caused disease. Germs were still a secret. Microscopes hadn't been imagined, but people still had theories. Some swore by miasma, bad air, thick with stink that brought sickness on the breeze. If the village smelled of manure, rot, and smoke, it was dangerous. They weren't wrong, just not for the reasons they thought. To fight it, people stuffed herbs into their sleeves, carried flowers, held vinegar-soaked cloths over their mouths. It helped the nose, not the lungs, but it felt like protection. Others said illness came from sin. If your child was ill, it was a test. If your crops failed and your body followed, it must have been something you did or didn't do. It could be your fault, or your neighbor's goat. There were old beliefs, local ones passed down like lullabies, strange but comforting. A charm around the wrist, a stone under the pillow, a whispered word by the door. Sometimes they worked, sometimes they didn't, but always they were tried. Because when sickness came, and it always came, you held on to anything that offered even the faintest light. Some believed illness came from the evil eye, a glare cast with envy or anger, or just a little too much attention. Others blamed the moon, the tide, a spirit in the woods, or a saint who hadn't been properly thanked. One theory held that sickness slipped in through the soles of your feet. The fix? Boil them, and if that didn't work, burn something. Maybe a handful of herbs, maybe your mattress. The cures, like the causes, often made more sense in the moment than they did later. If you had a fever, the solution might be to bleed you. A local man would show up, blade in hand, bowl at the ready, sure of himself and not much else. Sometimes they used leeches, sometimes sharpened stones. The idea was to balance your humours. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. You'd never seen them. But if something was wrong, they were probably to blame. A swelling, wrap it in mashed herbs and mud, or in warm bread tied with cloth and a whispered hope. Some things helped, many didn't. A few made it worse. But the important thing was that something was being done. If your stomach hurt, you might chew charcoal. If you coughed blood, you might drink wine with crushed pearls. If your vision blurred, someone might wave smoke over your head and recite a prayer. If your leg turned black, that was the end of remedies. There were plague amulets, worn tight to the skin, made of bone or metal, etched with symbols, blessed by priests. Some buried onions in the corners of their homes. Others strung up garlic, hung iron nails by the door, or scratched crosses into the wood. One common cure involved tying a live chicken to the infected area. The idea was that the sickness might leave you and enter the bird. It didn't, but in a world with few answers, people clung to anything. Illness was lonely, but not in the modern sense. There were no quarantines, no calls to emergency lines. You just tried to keep working until you couldn't. Then you lay down, and the world kept moving. Your children were fed. The animals were fed. You were given soup, maybe. A damp cloth on your forehead, a whispered prayer. Sometimes you got better. The fever lifted. The swelling shrank. You stood up again, slower than before, and went back to work. Sometimes you didn't. And when that happened, your family lit a candle. The plagues of that time weren't always the ones that made it into history books. Often they were quiet, drawn out, invisible to anyone more than a mile away. A bad cough, a swollen throat, a sudden rash, smallpox, leprosy, dysentery, even a strong flu could lay a village low. There were no graphs, no numbers, just stories. A boy said his uncle died last week in the next valley. A merchant said 2 children were buried before dawn. You listened. You started boiling your water. You slept with a clove of garlic. You avoided the house at the edge of the path. Death wasn't always feared, but it was recognized. People knew its rhythm, the slowed breath, the still hands, the quiet eyes. When someone began to die, the village changed. The fire burned lower. The room went still. A few soft words were spoken, not to stop it, just to let it pass with dignity. So when the Black Death came, it wasn't unfamiliar, not at first. People already knew what it meant to lose. They already knew how to prepare a body, how to weep without sound. But the scale was different. This wasn't slow. It was fast, violent, brutal. People woke with aches and were dead by nightfall. Buboes swelled beneath arms and between legs. Fever burned the mind. Blood turned dark and thick, and it spread, fast, and without mercy. And if you were lucky, you woke with the sun, not to leisure, but to labor. Morning came not with alarms, but with cold air and the rustle of others rising. A new day meant new tasks. The fire had to be stirred back to life, water fetched, tools prepared. There was no question of skipping a day's work unless you were too sick to stand. Even then, some tried, because there were mouths to feed and fields to tend and expectations to meet. The Lord's fields, the church's dues, your own thin patch of land if you were lucky enough to have it. Breakfast, if it existed, was bread, maybe cheese, maybe ale, maybe nothing. You ate what was left or what could be spared. Children were sent out early, gathering kindling, chasing off birds from the barley. No one wasted time. Life was structured but not leisurely. The tolling of bells bells from the village church gave the rhythm, matins, prime, terce, and so on through the day. Even if you weren't inside the chapel, you moved to its sound. It reminded you that time was passing, and that time belonged to God, not you. And so you labored, with hands that were already cracked from frost or work, with backs bent not from age but from years of stooping, with knees that ached before you turned 20. The days were long, but they were also numbered, and everyone knew it. There was little room for ambition, but there was pride in surviving the frost, in bringing in the sheaves, in repairing a broken yoke without help. These small victories mattered. No one carved them in stone, but they were remembered in conversation, in quiet respect from neighbors. And in the rare moments of rest, on feast days, or at the end of harvest, there was music. Rough, simple, communal. Someone with a drum, someone with a pipe. Voices rising in song, not because life was easy, but because it was hard, and music helped make sense of that. There was laughter too, dark, sharp, often at your own expense, a way of keeping pain at a distance. If your boot tore, if your cart broke, if your pig ran into the woods, you cursed, then you joked. Because what else could you do? The world wasn't kind, but it was knowable. Seasons changed, lords changed, even kings died. But the wheel turned. And if you could hang on, you might see your children grow. You might teach them the tricks you'd learned, how to keep warm with one blanket, how to find dry wood after a rain, how to tell which mushrooms wouldn't kill you. That kind of wisdom wasn't written, it was spoken, shown, lived, and if you passed it on, then in some small way, you endured, beyond sickness, beyond silence, beyond the slow erosion of years. You didn't think of yourself as important, but you were the foundation, the reason the fields were full and the granaries weren't empty, the reason there was bread on the Lord's table and incense in the church. You lived close to the earth and close to the edge, but you lived. And in a world full of risk and ruin, that was no small thing. Would you like this to continue into another theme, like seasons, childbirth, or village customs? Sleep came only when the pain of the day began to fade, when sore feet stopped burning and tired muscles stopped aching. If you were lucky, you got a few quiet hours. If not, you just lay there, waiting for morning to give you a reason to get up. The house never really went silent at night. There was the sound of the fire popping, the wind whispering through the roof. A baby might cry, a cow might move in its stall, and sometimes someone would start coughing. A deep, wet cough that lasted too long. Everyone heard it, but no one said anything. That was just how things were. The fear of night was real. And it made sense. The dark held real dangers, some from the mind, others from the world around you. Wolves, for example. In some places, you could hear them howling close to the village. They weren't just stories. They were real and hungry. Then there were people, thieves, strangers, troublemakers. Sometimes a fire started from a single coal. A heavy snow might make the roof creak, and then there were the things you couldn't explain. Ghosts, spirits, witches, demons. People didn't speak of them openly, but everyone believed. So you followed little rituals to keep safe. You left a piece of iron by the door. You made the sign of the cross over the fireplace. You whispered blessings over your bed. You hung herbs like rosemary or sage above the doors. Sometimes you tied a piece of string around a child's wrist, just in case. Even with all this, Some believed that sleep itself was risky, that your soul wandered while your body rested. So you got ready carefully. You covered the mirrors. You made sure the bed faced the fire. You never let your feet point toward the door. And then there was the cold. It got in through every crack and space, through the walls, the roof, the door. People didn't sleep under thick blankets. They layered up with wool, cloaks, and fur. Taking off your clothes for bed, that would have sounded crazy. You often slept in everything you wore during the day, sometimes even your boots. Sleeping beside others helped you stay warm, but it wasn't always comfortable. Someone always moved. Someone always talked in their sleep. There were elbows in your ribs, knees poking your back. The family dog might sneak in and surprise you, but that was normal. You didn't expect quiet. You expected closeness, and in that closeness, there was comfort. You heard your father breathing, your child turning over, your grandmother whispering a prayer. It wasn't perfect, but it felt human. It felt shared. Dreams were important too. A field of wheat in a dream might mean good luck. A snake could mean sickness. A broken tooth might mean death. You learned to read these signs, or you knew who in the village could. There were dream readers, not official ones, but people trusted them. The church had its own views. It said some dreams came from the devil. That night was a time when bad thoughts could sneak in, so you were told to pray before sleep, to clear your mind, to keep your soul ready in case you didn't wake up, because sometimes people didn't. Illness could get worse in the night, a fever could rise, a cough could turn deadly. By morning, someone might be gone, quietly, as if something had taken them. That's why mornings felt so special. When the light came back, when the rooster crowed, when the fire was stirred, it meant you had made it through again. You sat up slowly. Your body reminded you of its weight and pain, even if you were young. The cold stung your nose. You rubbed your eyes. You looked around, counted the ones you loved. Anyone still asleep was gently checked, just to be sure. And then, once you saw everyone was still breathing, the day could begin. Water was fetched, bread was made, the animals were fed. If your dream felt important, you shared it, and the memory of the night slowly faded. Not gone, just softened, tucked into the next stretch of time. In winter, sleep came early and stayed long. In summer, it was shorter, but the pattern stayed the same. First sleep, then a short waking time, then second sleep. No clocks, but still a rhythm. And even though life wasn't always easy, there was something honest about that rhythm, something steady. You weren't chasing comfort. You were chasing survival. And if you found rest now and then, a warm moment, a night without fear, a dream that didn't scare you, that was a gift. Not something you expected, just something you were thankful for. Some years were hard, others were much worse. In hard years you were hungry, but famine was different. Hunger has rules. You stretch food, you plan, you hold on to hope, but famine breaks those rules. Famine is when the ground fails you, when the storage bins are empty, and pretending it'll be better next week feels like lying. In a medieval village, you saw it coming. It started in the spring. Maybe it rained too much, or not at all. The barley didn't grow right, the beans flowered but dried out, cabbages split open before they were ready, wheat stayed short like it already knew the end. You noticed, everyone noticed, but no one said anything out loud. They just did the math in their heads, quietly, privately. How much food is left? How much seed can we save? How much can we eat without losing next year's crop? The answers were always hard. The worst part wasn't winter, it was summer. That's when the real decisions had to be made. Do you plant the seeds or grind them into flour? Do you risk everything for a harvest that may not come? Or do you feed your child now? so the meals got smaller. The soup got thinner. The bread was cut into smaller and smaller pieces. The bowls didn't go away. They just showed up less often. You didn't panic. Yet. You told yourself it would be okay. That it had happened before. That another village might trade with you. That maybe the Lord's stores could help. You still had hope, but not much else. By August, hope was harder to hold. By September, it slipped away. You stopped feeding the animals first. The chickens stopped clucking. The goats cried less and less. The dog, if you had one, followed you everywhere, like it knew it was next. Bread became sacred. One small loaf shared between 5 people. Everyone chewed slowly. No one said anything about the crust. Every crumb was gathered like it mattered. The stew. Just hot water now. Any colour it had came from the pot, not the food. You boiled weeds. You dug up roots. You picked plants you didn't know and hoped they wouldn't hurt you. Sometimes they didn't. You didn't sleep much, not because of fear, but because your stomach wouldn't let you. The children stopped asking questions. That's how you knew it was real. They didn't ask when bread was coming. They didn't ask for treats or stories. They just sat near the fire, quiet. They were learning how to wait. Your neighbors? You didn't see them anymore. The village grew quiet. No laughter in the lanes. No shouting about sheep. Just the sound of coughing and wood splitting. Famine didn't turn people mean. It just made them quiet. Sometimes someone brought back a rabbit or a bird or a handful of bitter acorns to soak and grind. You ate them, even if they tasted awful. You smiled anyway, not because it was good, but because it was something. You tried not to hate the manor. Sometimes they gave out grain, other times they didn't. The steward came around less and less. That was both good and bad. Good, because he wasn't there to collect more from you. Bad, because he wasn't bringing help either. His silence spoke louder than any words. The church tried to help. Bread after Mass, a few coins for the poorest, but even they were running out. You prayed more. Not always because you believed, but because it was something to do when your hands were too tired to work. Some people left the village, packed up and walked away, searching for food, work, or a sign from God. Some came back, some didn't. You never asked what happened to them. You were too tired. Famine changes your body. You don't feel your ribs from the outside first. You feel them from inside, like they're pressing against your skin. You get up slower, bruise easier. You wake with your hands clenched, as if you're still holding the tools you no longer use. The cold cuts deeper. The fire becomes your best friend. You spend more time feeding it than cooking on it. You sit close. You sleep facing it. You feed the fire, even if you can't feed yourself. Heat is the one comfort left. By now, you've eaten everything that could be eaten. The roots, the weeds, the last handful of dried beans, the stale flour. You've boiled bones over and over. You soaked bark in water. You made famine bread that cracked your tooth. And when real food was gone, you looked at things that weren't food, but maybe could be. Leather, boiled, salted, not tasty, not filling, but you could chew it. You once found a rat. You didn't scream. You thanked God. Then you hid it. Cooked it alone. Told no one. You still feel guilty, but you don't regret it. Your dreams got strange. You dreamed of feasts, long tables full of meat and bread and honey. You woke up chewing your tongue. You dreamed of boiling pots even though you hadn't boiled anything in days. You dreamed of animals returning, of green plants pushing up through snow. You dreamed of being a child when hunger was smaller, easier. Some nights you dreamed of being full. Those dreams made you cry. The graveyard grew slowly at first, then faster, then too fast to keep up. You knew someone had died when the church bell stayed silent. It meant no one had the strength to ring it. The grave was shallow, the prayer short, the mourning silent. Everyone was busy just staying alive. You wanted to cry, to grieve, but you couldn't afford the feeling. You held it in, like everything else. And then, as it always does, the famine ended. Not all at once, slowly, gently. Rain came and stayed. The dirt softened, seeds broke open, thin shoots reached for the sky. Weak, but alive, you had just enough energy to hope. The first harvest wasn't for you. It went to the children, to the elders. You took the smallest bowl. You smiled as you passed it around. When the first real loaf of bread came from the oven, cracked on top, dark on the bottom, you just stared at it. Before you ate, you remembered every empty day, every trick you used, every quiet lie you told to protect someone. You ate slowly, and this time it filled you. By then, the church had already claimed you. Long ago, at your baptism, it had taken your name, whispered blessings over your breath in words you didn't understand, and tied your soul to something much bigger than your village. You belonged to the church not by choice, but because there was no other way. In the quiet parts of life, before the fire caught in the morning, during wind-filled nights, you felt it like a weight. The church didn't just exist next to your life. It shaped it, judged it, took from it, forgave it, promised to guide it after death. The church was the air you breathed, the dirt beneath your feet, the rhythm of your days. It was the voice that would speak at your grave, and the one that whispered about that day long before it came. The priest, usually the only one who could read, was more than your confessor. He was your calendar, your guide, your closest thing to a prophet. He knew how the stars moved, why a pig might die, or when a storm might strike. He walked the village as someone who carried both comfort and warning in his robes. You brought your sins to him in a whisper, and hoped he wouldn't look disappointed. You tried not to think about what he knew. You saw him at birth, at marriage, and at death. The 3 moments no one escaped. And in between, he stood at the altar, speaking for a God you feared more than loved. Because love, you were told, came after obedience. The Mass was in Latin. It might as well have been a spell. You stood beside your family in the cold stone church, your feet numb, your ears straining to catch meaning in the priest's chant. You didn't understand what he said as he lifted the bread, but you believed, or you tried to, that something unseen had just happened, that the bread wasn't bread, that the wine wasn't wine, that gestures and murmurs could shift the sky. You didn't speak the words, but they moved through you anyway. You mouthed along where you could. You crossed yourself when the others did. You learned the rhythm of the sacred the way you learned to walk to the well. You didn't know every step, but you knew you needed to take them. The church marked your year, told you when to fast, when to feast. It broke time into pieces: Lent, Advent, Epiphany, All Saints. No one said April. You said after Easter, or before St. Michael's. It told you what to eat, when to eat, and how bad you should feel if you liked it too much. 40 days without meat before Easter, then a feast so heavy it made you lightheaded. Fish on Fridays, even if you lived nowhere near water. The rich had almond milk, you had turnips and thin broth. On feast days, you shared what you could. On fast days, you imagined what you couldn't. Even with an empty bowl, your plate was full of rules. Your calendar wasn't just holy, it was a ledger, a reminder of what you owed. The church took a tenth of what you had, no matter what that was. Grain, eggs, wool, a chicken, a jug of cider. If it came from your field or your body, it had a price. You gave it because it was God's portion, that's what you were told, but it wasn't God who came to get it. It was the priest, or the steward, silent and writing in his book. You saw your best barley go to the tithe barn, which was always bigger than your own house. You watched your neighbor give up their last sack of oats, while the priest prayed for mercy they had just paid for. And when the rains didn't come, or the frost came too soon, the debt didn't shrink. You owed what you owed. Sometimes you could pay with candles, or labor. Sometimes you couldn't. Sometimes the weight of the debt felt like a second spine, curving your back even when you stood straight. But the church didn't only take, it gave. Not always what you wanted, not always what you needed, but something. It gave you stories. It gave your days a shape. It gave you reasons. When your cow died for no reason, the priest told you which saint to pray to. When your child got sick, he told you it might be a test, or a punishment, or the devil slipping in through a crack in your belief. He offered blessings, holy water, quiet words. He told you to light a candle, to walk to a shrine. Sometimes he gave you a relic, an old bone, a tooth, a bit of ribbon soaked in a martyr's blood. You held it like treasure. You might think that after everything they went through, after all the famines, the sicknesses, the heavy taxes from the manna, and the endless demands from the church, the people would have fought back more often. That after carrying so much for so long, something inside them would finally break. That one morning, as the frost melted and the ground turned soft again, they would say, "Enough." But most of the time, they didn't. It wasn't because they liked their suffering. No one likes hunger. No one enjoys digging a shallow grave for a child or watching a good cow fall sick. It wasn't because they were too simple to know they were being used. People knew. They just also knew what happened to those who pushed too hard. The Lord had guards. The church had records. The law was not made for them. It was made to keep them in place. Rebellion wasn't just dangerous. It was deadly. Not just for the one who started it, but for their family, their neighbors, sometimes the whole village. Land could be taken. Fields burned. People hung. So most people didn't rise up. They kept their heads down. They survived as best they could. They didn't call it bravery, but it was. Their resistance wasn't loud. It was quiet. It was staying alive. It was feeding each other, even when the pot was nearly empty. It was singing while they worked, and laughing when they could. It was walking to church in the rain because the rhythm of ritual helped hold them together. It was holding a newborn and deciding to hope, even when they'd buried another child just last year. Some forms of strength aren't about shouting. They're about standing back up every single morning, even when your knees hurt and your stomach is empty. It's about planting again after the last harvest failed. About showing up again and again, because the world didn't give you many choices, but you still made the ones you could. And sometimes they did rise. A rumor would spread, a group would form, a banner would be raised. For a moment, they'd stand together and say, "No more." And sometimes they won, or at least made enough noise that the lords had to listen, but more often they were punished. When you picture medieval times, your brain probably goes to knights jousting, goblets overflowing, or fairs with lute music and roasted meats. But for your average peasant, winter wasn't festive. Winter was survival mode. It wasn't a season. It was a yearly final boss battle. And spoiler alert, there were no cheat codes. Imagine this. You're tucked inside a hut made of mud, straw, and sheer optimism. The walls are so thin, You could hear a bird cough from the forest. There's no glass in the window, just a hole with some stretched animal hide over it. And forget about central heating. The only temperature control was the fire in the hearth, which mostly served to toast your toes if you were lucky enough to be sitting right in front of it. Outside, the cold bites. Inside, slightly less bitey. Think of it as nature's version of room temperature, with a side of frostbite. And the nights? Oh, the nights. They were long, dark, and full of howling wind that slipped through every crack like an uninvited ghost. The fire would sputter and wheeze, trying its best, but honestly, it was hanging on just as hard as everyone else. If you were on the far side of the room, sorry, you might as well have been camping outside. Minus the marshmallows, and the tent, and the dignity. Peasant homes didn't come with central heating or cozy corners. They came with frost-nipped toes and regret. And don't think clothing saved the day. There were no fur-lined parkas or goose-down comforters here. You had a couple of scratchy wool tunics, a cloak that smelled vaguely of wet goat, and the desperate hope that layering them would somehow transform you into a human radiator. Spoiler alert, it didn't. Beds? If you were lucky, you had a sack stuffed with straw and a few flattened rushes. If you were really lucky, that straw only had a few fleas. No quilts, no pillows, just you, some itchy bedding, and the persistent sense that medieval luxury was a lie. But let's be clear, the cold wasn't just a nuisance, it was lethal. Frostbite, hypothermia, and did they just freeze to death in their sleep were constant winter companions, especially for kids and the elderly. Every morning you woke up with all your fingers still attached was a small miracle. And that called for celebration, maybe with a slightly less frozen turnip for breakfast. Because surviving winter in medieval times wasn't about comfort. It was about sheer, stubborn endurance. You piled on every scrap of cloth you owned, snuggled up with the livestock for warmth, and prayed to wake up without icicles forming, in places icicles should never form. And you thought your apartment was drafty? If your window doesn't quite close and lets in a breeze, medieval peasants would laugh through chattering teeth. Their homes weren't just drafty, they were basically open-air wind tunnels with a slight mud coating. Most peasant houses were built using what historians generously call wattle and daub, which is a fancy way of saying weaved sticks smeared with mud, straw, and, yes, animal dung. Not for aesthetic reasons, dung was cheap, sticky, and surprisingly good at plugging gaps. So, points for resourcefulness? But even the most lovingly smeared walls didn't stand a chance against real winter weather. Wind found every crack, crevice, and moral weakness. It slipped inside like an uninvited guest, refused to leave, and made sure you never got too cozy. Roofs? Ah yes, those charming thatched roofs. They looked quaint in drawings, but in reality, after a few weeks of rain, snow, and wildlife invasions, they sagged, leaked, and occasionally dropped the odd squirrel onto your dinner. You weren't living in a house. You were surviving in a very leaky, hay-scented compromise. And windows? If they existed at all, they were laughably tiny, covered with stretched animal hide or a wooden shutter that barely closed. Natural light? Maybe. Insulation? Not a chance. Glass was so outrageously expensive back then that even the local lord, yes, the guy with the castle and the fancy hat, might have only had a single tiny pane in the whole manor. As for the peasants, they were just hoping the wind didn't rip the cowhide off their window mid-blizzard and send it flying into the next village. Expectations were low. Survival was the goal. And if the walls weren't already doing a poor enough job of keeping the cold out, the floors were more than happy to help it sneak in. You see, the average medieval peasant's floor wasn't made of wood or stone. It was dirt. Just plain, compacted earth. And when it rained or snowed, that dirt turned into mud. Slowly. From underneath. Congratulations. You now had an unintentional indoor swamp. Real estate listings might have called it a natural water feature, but no one was fooled. In winter, every step across your own floor felt like wading through a half-frozen marsh. Cold from above, cold from below, cold from inside your own walls. It was a full surround sound experience in suffering. But here's the thing. Medieval peasants weren't complainers. They were problem solvers, resourceful, slightly desperate. They stuffed moss into the cracks, jammed cloth into every drafty gap, and huddled together like human space heaters. Insulation? Nah. Just your cousin's body heat and the faint hope that no one rolled over too far in the night. Sometimes they'd smear the walls with sheep grease. Not for decoration, though who doesn't love a nice greasy sheen, but because it helped seal gaps. It was basically nature's caulk. If you were lucky, your house didn't smell like barnyard despair all the time. And when your entire home was held together by dung, mud, and hope, you learned to laugh, or at least chitter weakly through clenched, frostbitten teeth. But the cold didn't just attack from the sides. No, the most silent, sneaky enemy rose from beneath, the frozen earth itself. Floors were less floors and more ground, but slightly flatter. If someone had kindly tossed some straw or rushes across it, congratulations. You now had something between you and the soul-sapping chill of the underworld. Barely. That ground cold was ruthless. It crept through the straw, up through your feet, into your bones, and straight into your will to live. Drop anything on the floor in the middle of the night? It's gone. Frozen. Now part of the architecture. To fight back, some peasants piled thick layers of straw on the floor as insulation. If you were lucky, or sneaky enough to nab it from your neighbor's field under the cover of darkness, you might get enough to make it work, for a while. But straw flattened fast, grew mold even faster, and made every step sound like you were walking on a bowl of cornflakes. Rushes were the other option. Homes would lay them down, then just keep tossing fresh ones over the old, never bothering to clean out the decomposing layers beneath. Over time, these floors developed into a kind of medieval ecosystem. It was like carpet. If your carpet was damp, vaguely alive, and probably full of uninvited guests like fleas, mice, and other mystery creatures. As for beds, they didn't offer much of a break. Think wooden frame, topped with more straw or hay, and that's it. No mattresses, no feather toppers, no pillow top luxury. Just the rustic charm of scratchy straw poking into your back while you try to dream about not freezing to death. Forget cozy mattresses. Medieval peasants slept on beds that crackled, shifted, and poked at them like nature's version of a whoopee cushion. Comfort wasn't the goal. Tossing and turning wasn't a sign of insomnia. It was survival strategy. A desperate midnight shuffle to keep your blood moving and avoid waking up with one side of your body frozen stiff. The truth? Medieval peasants didn't beat the icy ground. They simply learned to exist slightly above it, like awkward birds perched on straw nests. A good night's sleep didn't mean sweet dreams. It meant waking up with all your limbs intact. And if you managed that, you were winning. Now, if there was a single true winter hero in a medieval home, it wasn't the sagging roof, the drafty walls, or even the stubborn layer of dung and moss, trying its best to block the wind. Number it was the hearth. The hearth was the soul of the house, the gritty, smoky, stubborn heart that pulsed with heat, light, and the only thing standing between you and a slow, frosty demise. Forget mantles and fancy fireplaces. In a peasant's home, the hearth was a pit in the floor, maybe some rocks shoved together, with a few burning logs doing their best not to die out before you did. And chimneys? Not unless you lived in an actual castle. Instead, the smoke just lingered. It drifted around the room like it was looking for a place to settle, occasionally wandering out through a hole in the roof or squeezing through a crack in the wall. If it couldn't find a way out, into your lungs it went. Breathing wasn't great. Living to old age wasn't guaranteed. But on the upside, your fleas didn't last long in that level of indoor fumigation. Who needs bug spray when you've got passive smoke warfare 24/7? But the hearth wasn't just a heat source. It was the stove, the nightlight, the social hub. People gathered around it not just for warmth, but for stories, gossip, arguments, and that blank fire stare we all fall into when there's nothing else to look at. In winter, the fire was your entertainment, your hope, your literal lifeline, and keeping it alive was a mission. Letting the fire die overnight, that was practically a death sentence. There were no matches, no lighters. Reigniting a fire in the depths of winter meant flint, steel, fragile kindling, and a whole lot of frustrated whisper yelling at damp wood while your fingers slowly went numb. So every member of the family had their role, watching the embers, feeding the flames, adding sticks, moss, dried peat, or, if you were truly blessed, a scrap of dry wood. It wasn't just a chore, it was a nightly war effort against the creeping cold that never really slept. The hearth didn't guarantee survival, but without it, survival was off the table. It sputtered, it smoked, sometimes it coughed more than it crackled. But that little patch of glowing coals was everything. It was defiance in the face of winter. It was the last line of defense. It was hope in flickering orange. Because in the medieval world, if there was one thing peasants feared more than disease, famine, or running out of ale, it was waking up to a dead fire. No fire meant the cold came knocking, and it didn't knock politely. Lighters, dream on. If you wanted fire in the Middle Ages, you had to earn it. That meant smashing flint and steel together in the cold, praying one lonely spark would catch, and then nursing that spark like it was your only child. Because it was, in a way. Drop the ball, and it was back to freezing your fingers off in the dark while questioning your life choices. And if you needed motivation, cue the distant howl of a hungry wolf echoing through the night. So peasants got clever. They banked the fire. Not in a cozy, set it and forget it way. This wasn't medieval 401k. Firebanking meant carefully burying the glowing embers under a thick layer of ash right before bed. Ash, it turns out, is nature's sleepy time blanket. It insulated the coals just enough to keep them barely alive until morning. Done right? You could wander over at dawn, poke the pile, toss on some wood and poof, instant fire, no frostbite required. Done wrong? Well, let's just say your morning started with frozen regret and a lot of grumbling. But firebanking wasn't just a task. It was art, passed down like a family recipe with way higher stakes. Everyone had an opinion. Some swore by bone-dry ash. Others said a little dampness kept the coals happy. Some packed it tight like a coal burrito. Others let it breathe, like it was on spa day. Suggest a better technique, and you could spark a full-blown argument. Think medieval Twitter, but with fewer vowels and more sheep. Of course, even a perfectly banked fire wasn't safe. A gust of wind could sneak through a wall crack and snuff it out. Or, occasionally, a clumsy goat might take a midnight stroll straight into the hearth. Yes, that happened. That's why some families took shifts checking the coals overnight. An early version of creeping to the thermostat in your socks, except colder, darker, and with a slightly higher chance of being trampled by livestock. But even one surviving ember? That was a win. That ember meant warmth, cooking, life. It meant one more day not becoming a medieval popsicle. Now, in those frigid nights, when the fire was gasping and the wind was doing its best ghost impression, there was one final, foolproof source of warmth: each other. And if that meant sleeping elbow to elbow with your entire family, 3 neighbors, 2 pigs, and a goose named Harold, so be it. Privacy? Cute idea. Not a thing. On winter nights, survival meant forming a desperate pile of humans and animals, all mashed together like a medieval casserole, steamy, chaotic, and weirdly effective. The warmest corner of the house became the designated cuddle zone. Everyone wore whatever scraps of cloth they could find. Kids were tucked between adults, elders buried in the middle, and if Cousin Ethel showed up late, scoot over, there's always room. If you were lucky, you got the middle. If you weren't, you got the outside, the medieval equivalent of sleeping beside a walk-in freezer. And heaven help you if you rolled over during the night and booted someone into a draft. Accidentally shoved grandma into a cold spot. You just became a family legend. For all the wrong reasons. Even bedding was a team effort. One big straw mattress, or something pretending to be one, flattened by the nightly weight of generations. Was it soft? Number. Did it smell great? Also number. But in a battle against frostbite, you stopped caring around bedtime. Body heat wasn't a luxury, it was strategy. Some guides even suggested putting the strongest, warmest people on the outside like human thermal shields. Babies and elders, right in the center, tucked in tight like tiny royal embers. Because in the medieval winter, staying warm wasn't just an act of comfort. It was an act of solidarity, a shared struggle, and sometimes it was just a really awkward family sleepover with livestock. This wasn't just about surviving, it became a way of life. Huddled together night after freezing night, people did more than share body heat. They shared stories, songs, secrets whispered under wool blankets, and more than a few arguments about who had the coldest toes. Family bonding wasn't optional. It was embedded into the straw-packed floor. So next time your sibling steals the blanket or your dog hogs the bed, just remember, at least you're not wedged between a snoring uncle and a judgmental goat that keeps staring like it knows your secrets. And speaking of winter roommates, modern flatmates have nothing on medieval house guests. Enter the livestock. Cows, goats, pigs, chickens, basically anything that had a pulse and produced heat, got a golden ticket indoors. This wasn't a quirky rural aesthetic. It was survival strategy 101. Every animal in the house meant one more barrier against frostbite, one more breath fogging up the icy air. And as a bonus, if your goat was sleeping beside you, it was slightly less likely to disappear into someone else's stew pot by morning. Security system and space heater in one smelly, head-butting package. By nightfall, the peasant home transformed into a living, mooing furnace. Chickens claimed the corners. Pigs stretched out wherever they pleased, snorting like they owned the place. Cows leaned lazily against the walls, chewing cud like bored roommates with nothing better to do. It was crowded. It was chaotic. It was pungent. Ever been stuck in a packed car with someone who's gone 3 days without deodorant? Now replace the person with a pig. Add mud. Take away the windows. Congratulations. You've unlocked the medieval winter experience. And the smell? Oh, the smell. By spring, the house had absorbed months of damp, dung, and dander. It didn't need a scent diffuser. It was the scent. But peasants developed a selective nose, a survival skill nearly as vital as firebanking. Because the truth was undeniable. More animals meant more warmth. The colder the night, the closer the cows, and certain creatures earned VIP status. Cows got pride of place near the family, giant, docile furnaces of body heat. Goats followed because, well, goats will always find a way inside. Chickens roosted in rafters and baskets, occasionally attempting surprise landings on unsuspecting heads. And pigs? Pigs did whatever pigs wanted, usually in the middle of the floor. Sure, there were risks. A chicken might decide your scalp is the perfect roost at 3 a.m., or you might step into something deeply regrettable before sunrise. But that was the trade-off, and while the livestock helped, peasants had to do their own share of insulation too, namely, with the one fashion trend that never went out of style: wear everything you own, all at once. There were no runways in medieval villages, unless you count the muddy path between the dung heap and the well. Clothes weren't about aesthetics, they were armour against the cold. Start with a linen undershirt that hadn't seen soap in a suspiciously long time. Over that, a wool tunic. Then maybe another, and a cloak. And if you were blessed by the wool gods, a patchy sheepskin tossed over your shoulders like you just won the world's itchiest tournament. Leggings sagged. Belts were tied with whatever string you had. Scarves were often just long rags pretending to be fancy. And footwear? If you had boots, great. You were basically royalty. Most peasants just wrapped their feet in scraps of cloth, stuffed them into wooden clogs, and hoped for the best. If your toes still worked by morning, it was considered a win. Because in the icy war of medieval winter, it didn't matter how you looked. What mattered was waking up slightly less frozen than you were the night before. And forget about washing all those layers. Doing laundry in winter meant dragging your clothes to a frozen stream, hacking through a crust of ice, and praying you didn't drop your only shirt into the current. If you were lucky, it would dry in a couple of days. If you were unlucky, you just created the world's saddest frozen shirt sculpture. Most peasants wisely opted for the smoke, sweat, and sheep signature scent. It wasn't exactly Chanel No. 5, but it beat freezing to death in a damp tunic. Strangely enough, all that grime had a hidden perk: insulation. That crusty, crunchy, grease-glazed outer shell. It trapped heat. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of Gore-Tex, just itchier, smellier, and completely socially unacceptable by modern standards. Dirt didn't just cling to you, it protected you. It was survival by stink. Hats, scarves, and gloves weren't accessories, they were lifelines. A wool cap could mean the difference between waking up cold or waking up frozen to your pillow. Gloves were cobbled together from whatever was lying around. Old fabric scraps, cracked leather, a dream. They rarely matched, and often looked like puppets that had seen too much. But they worked. Children didn't escape the fashion horror either. They were bundled so thoroughly they resembled overstuffed vegetables, Little waddling turnips with scarves for arms. Forget running. Walking across the room required serious planning and 3 attempts to stand up. Style? Elegance? Never heard of them. Warmth was the real flex. The more shapeless and filthy your silhouette, the more likely you were to survive the night. So next time you groan about layering up for a frosty morning, just remember, medieval peasants walked around wearing their entire wardrobe at once, looked like lumpy scarecrows, and were grateful for it. In the medieval peasant playbook, dirt wasn't a nuisance. It was tactical. It wasn't a sign you'd given up. It was a carefully cultivated crust of survival. Getting grimy was less a hygiene failure and more a weatherproofing technique. Because here's the thing, freshly washed linen? Useless. It breathed, sure, but in the middle of winter, you didn't want breathability. You wanted armor, and dirt delivered. As peasants slogged through their days, their clothes accumulated a lovely cocktail of mud, sweat, soot, and natural oils. Over time, this filth clogged the gaps in fabric and turned breezy garments into wind-resistant shields. You didn't wear your cloak, you grew into it. Yes, you smelled like a goat that lost a bet, but guess what? You were warm. And in that eternal trade-off, comfort versus survival, warmth always won. Some folks even believed washing during winter could make you sick. Strip away your sacred filth layer, and the cold would sneak in like a tax collector with frostbite. So peasants kept their dirt armor intact. Baths were rare, laundry was rarer, and soap? That was for truly special occasions, like a bishop's visit or your own funeral. Adding to the strategy, peasants didn't change their clothes so much as layer them into legend. You didn't take off last month's shirt. You just threw a new tunic over it and called it progress. Eventually, you became a walking scrapbook of the past 6 weeks. Every stain told a story. That time you slipped in the mud and lived, or when a goat sneezed on you and you simply carried on. To outsiders, peasants may have looked and smelled like hygiene was a myth, but peasants knew better. That crusty tunic wasn't failure, it was armor, a thermal barrier against death by frostbite. You didn't smell like flowers, but you also didn't wake up with your toes frozen off. Priorities. Besides, in a world where everyone stank to high heaven, nobody noticed. Nose blindness wasn't a side effect. It was a survival skill. So yes, in medieval winters, filth wasn't a flaw. It was fashion. It was function. And if your outer layer could stand up on its own by February, congratulations, you were winning. Now, if you're picturing medieval peasants tucked into plush feather beds under embroidered quilts, allow us to ruin that fantasy real quick. The average peasant bed was more DIY disaster than rustic comfort. If you were lucky, you had a rough wooden frame. If not, you just flung a sack of straw on the floor and hoped nothing bit you. No memory foam, no springs, just a crunchy, lumpy mass that smelled faintly of barnyard and broken dreams. Turning over at night brought the soothing sounds of crinkling straw and the occasional sharp jab from a stalk that clearly had a vendetta. Some skipped the frame entirely and embraced the earth-connected lifestyle, which is a nice way of saying they slept directly on the dirt. Influencers today would sell it as holistic. Back then, it was just Tuesday. Straw mattresses were temporary at best. Over time, they flattened, molded, invited bugs, and started growing their own ecosystem. Changing out the bedding was a major event, done maybe once a season, or when it started crawling. Rushes were a popular alternative. long grasses spread across the floor, sometimes mixed with herbs like lavender or rosemary to battle the eau de livestock that permeated every surface. Fresh rushes smelled nice for about 12 hours. After that, they became one with the household grime, a mulch of food scraps, dirt, and questionable mysteries. And then there were the bedfellows. Fleas, lice, and other charming little horrors adored straw bedding. If you woke up scratching more than you slept, congratulations. You were living your most authentic medieval life. Still, as humble and gross as they were, these makeshift beds mattered. Straw acted as insulation from the frozen ground. And when your whole family, plus livestock, piled on top, it created precious pockets of body heat. The original space heater, powered by snoring and mutual desperation. So the next time you flop into your clean, soft, posture-correcting mattress, remember, somewhere in history, a peasant is watching you from beyond the grave, wrapped in 6 layers of filth, grinning with 3 teeth and muttering, "Must be nice." When you live in a house made of sticks, mud, and sheer optimism, winter breezes aren't just a nuisance, they're personal. Medieval peasants didn't just battle the cold outside, they waged war against the icy fingers creeping through their walls. Their weapon of choice? Whatever could be crammed into a crack. And there were a lot of cracks. Walls warped, mud crumbled, thatch sagged. Cold air found new and creative ways to sneak in every night, like a petty ghost with a vendetta. So sealing the house wasn't maintenance, it was survival. Peasants stuffed gaps with moss, straw, scraps of cloth, dry grass, and even animal hair. If it was vaguely squishy and looked like it might slow down a breeze, it was shoved into a hole. Some folks even slapped extra layers of mud and dung onto their walls each winter, turning house repair into a hands-on mud spa with zero glamour. Picture it. You're standing in freezing temperatures, smearing cold manure onto your own house while muttering, "This is fine, this is peak luxury." And in a weird way, it was. Roof leaks? Oh, absolutely. Thatched roofs were cheap and common, but waterproof? Only in theory. Holes were patched with rags, reeds, or in moments of pure desperation, turf stolen from the neighbour's field. Over time, your home started to resemble a sad quilt, sewn by someone who ran out of thread and hope. Doors and windows, if you had them, were more suggestion than barrier. A wooden plank hanging on rusty nails was considered high security. Windows, more like holes, were covered with animal hides or cloth soaked in animal fat to block the wind. Bonus, your living room now smelled faintly like jerky. Every night was a showdown between ingenuity and the relentless sneakiness of cold. One minute you were half warm, the next, a draft would slap you awake like an icy hand of doom. But medieval peasants? They were stubborn, resourceful, and used to a life where slightly frozen was just baseline. They patched, they stuffed, they slapped on mud and hoped for the best. And somehow, against all odds, they made it through. The punishment was swift, harsh, public. Villagers watched their own hanged in the squares where they used to sell eggs and wool. The message was clear: stay in line. Still, it wasn't fear alone that kept most people from rebellion. It was the weight of everything else. If you want to understand why peasants didn't rise up more often, stop thinking of them as weak or foolish. They weren't. They were strong in the quiet way most people don't recognize. They were survivors, not of one bad year, but of every year. They lived lives with no margin, no safety net. When one season went wrong, it could take 2 more just to recover. When the stew was thin and the boots were full of holes, You didn't plan a rebellion. You patched the roof. You dug the last potatoes. You prayed the frost stayed away. Rebellion took time and planning, but survival took everything. The system worked, not because it was fair or good or efficient, but because it was old. It was deep. It had grown around them like a hedge, full of thorns and rules and rituals. You didn't need to understand it. You just needed to know what was expected. You owed your lord your labor. You owed the church your tenth. You owed the manor your silence. And in return, you were allowed to stay, to work your strip of land, to gather wood, to bake your bread, break the rules. And the punishment wasn't always death. Sometimes it was worse. Hunger, homelessness, a child taken, a father whipped, a cousin vanished in the night. Everyone knew a story like that. No one wanted to be the next one whispered about in the dark. And still, the village wasn't a battlefield. It was home. The people you might need to rise against were often the people you depended on. You hated the steward, maybe, but his wife gave you herbs when your child was sick. You hated the tithe, but the priest baptized your newborn and buried your mother. The village was tangled, deeply connected. You shared fences and tools, chickens and bread, joy and grief. To rip it all apart in anger would be to tear apart your own life with it. Rebellion didn't always feel righteous. Sometimes it just felt like breaking your own bones. And so they bent instead of breaking. It's easy, looking back from far away, to picture the peasant as a figure of endless submission, head bowed, back bent, hat in hand. But that image is wrong. It misses everything, because submission wasn't surrender. It was strategy. It was survival. They bargained. They bartered. They watched for small openings. They stole a little grain when they had to. They worked one field while dreaming of another. They knew what they were owed, even if they rarely got it. They suffered, yes, but they also endured. They found ways to live inside a system that never wanted them to thrive. They made lives anyway. They made families. They made memories. They made meaning. And that, in its own quiet way, was a kind of rebellion too. They bent. They found cracks in the walls and made homes in the spaces between the rules. A pig kept off the ledger, fed in secret behind a patch of brambles. An extra sack of rye buried beneath the floorboards, the dirt tamped down just so. A bribe not in coin, which could be missed but in eggs. Warm, round, forgettable. These were the rebellions they could afford. Small, quiet, invisible unless you knew where to look. The kind that let you sleep at night instead of swinging from a rope. They didn't shout or march or sharpen blades in the dark. They hid. They waited. They worked around the edges. They were practical people, shaped by a practical world. A world governed not by ideas, but by weather. Rain mattered more than fairness. Frost more than freedom. The question wasn't, what is just? It was, will this feed us through winter? And justice, real, true justice, was too rare to plan for, too slow to trust. Because lords changed. One died. Another took his place. Sometimes crueler, sometimes kinder, but always powerful. Priests grew old or moved on or fell ill, and were replaced by others with the same robes, the same sermons, the same collection plates. Rules shifted, bent, reformed like branches in a wind. But the wind still blew. The fields still needed sowing. The children still cried when there wasn't enough in the pot. You didn't revolt against the wind. You bowed your head and pulled your cloak tighter. You didn't fight the frost. You dug deeper, worked longer, prayed harder. You didn't scream at the dirt for failing to bloom. You coaxed it, pleaded with it, learned its silences. You endured. And the church helped shape that endurance, not always cruelly, but always completely. It whispered its own logic, a rhythm of suffering that made sense of everything. The sword might wound the body, but the church shaped the soul, and the soul, they told you, was what really mattered. The church taught that suffering wasn't a flaw in the system, it was the system, that pain was a path, that poverty was a virtue, that every empty bowl, every aching joint, every sleepless night was another brick in the road to salvation. You were told that the meek would inherit the earth, not now, not soon, but someday, eventually, maybe. You were taught that your trials were not punishment but purification, a fire to burn away your sins, a weight to make you humble. You were told that obedience was a kind of offering, that your silence was a kind of prayer, that every time you did not scream, did not steal, did not strike back, you were proving your worth to a God who saw everything. And if that wasn't enough, if the promise of heaven felt too faint, too far away, there was always the shadow of hell. They painted it for you in words and in firelight, in stained glass and carved wood, in the sermons that cracked through the silence of cold churches. A place of agony, a pit without end, fire, torment, gnashing of teeth, all of it waiting, just on the other side of a broken oath, a stolen loaf, a misspoken word, waiting for the one who forgot to kneel, waiting for the one who let their faith fray, waiting for the prayer that wasn't said. When you picture medieval times, your brain probably goes to knights jousting, goblets overflowing, or fairs with lute music and roasted meats. But for your average peasant, winter wasn't festive. Winter was survival mode. It wasn't a season. It was a yearly final boss battle. And spoiler alert, there were no cheat codes. Imagine this. You're tucked inside a hut made of mud, straw, and sheer optimism. The walls are so thin you could hear a bird cough from the forest. There's no glass in the window, just a hole with some stretched animal hide over it. And forget about central heating. The only temperature control was the fire in the hearth, which mostly served to toast your toes if you were lucky enough to be sitting right in front of it. Outside, the cold bites. Inside, slightly less bitey. Think of it as nature's version of room temperature with a side of frostbite. And the nights? Oh, the nights. They were long, dark, and full of howling wind that slipped through every crack like an uninvited ghost. The fire would sputter and wheeze, trying its best, but honestly, it was hanging on just as hard as everyone else. If you were on the far side of the room, sorry, you might as well have been camping outside, minus the marshmallows, and the tent, and the dignity. Peasant homes didn't come with central heating or cozy corners. They came with frost-nipped toes and regret. And don't think clothing saved the day. There were no fur-lined parkas or goose-down comforters here. You had a couple of scratchy wool tunics, a cloak that smelled vaguely of wet goat, and the desperate hope that layering them would somehow transform you into a human radiator. Spoiler alert, it didn't. Beds? If you were lucky, you had a sack stuffed with straw and a few flattened rushes. If you were really lucky, that straw only had a few fleas. No quilts, no pillows, just you, some itchy bedding, and the persistent sense that medieval luxury was a lie. But let's be clear, the cold wasn't just a nuisance, it was lethal. Frostbite, hypothermia, and did they just freeze to death in their sleep were constant winter companions, especially for kids and the elderly. Every morning you woke up with all your fingers still attached was a small miracle. And that called for celebration, maybe with a slightly less frozen turnip for breakfast. Because surviving winter in medieval times wasn't about comfort, it was about sheer stubborn endurance. You piled on every scrap of cloth you owned, snuggled up with the livestock for warmth, and prayed to wake up without icicles forming in places icicles should never form. And you thought your apartment was drafty. If your window doesn't quite close and lets in a breeze, medieval peasants would laugh through chattering teeth. Their homes weren't just drafty, they were basically open-air wind tunnels with a slight mud coating. Most peasant houses were built using what historians generously call wattle and daub, which is a fancy way of saying weaved sticks smeared with mud straw. And yes, animal dung. Not for aesthetic reasons. Dung was cheap, sticky, and surprisingly good at plugging gaps. So, points for resourcefulness. But even the most lovingly smeared walls didn't stand a chance against real winter weather. Wind found every crack, crevice, and moral weakness. It slipped inside like an uninvited guest, refused to leave, and made sure you never got too cozy. And when your entire home was held together by dung, mud, and hope, you learned to laugh, or at least chitter weakly through clenched, frostbitten teeth. But the cold didn't just attack from the sides. No, the most silent, sneaky enemy rose from beneath, the frozen earth itself. Floors were less floors and more ground, but slightly flatter. If someone had kindly tossed some straw or rushes across it, congratulations. You now had something between you and the soul-sapping chill of the underworld. Barely. That ground cold was ruthless. It crept through the straw, up through your feet, into your bones, and straight into your will to live. Drop anything on the floor in the middle of the night, it's gone, frozen, now part of the architecture. To fight back, some peasants piled thick layers of straw on the floor as insulation. If you were lucky or sneaky enough to nab it from your neighbor's field under the cover of darkness, you might get enough to make it work for a while. But straw flattened fast, grew mold even faster, and made every step sound like you were walking on a bowl of cornflakes. Rushes were the other option. Homes would lay them down, then just keep tossing fresh ones over the old, never bothering to clean out the decomposing layers beneath. Over time, these floors developed into a kind of medieval ecosystem. It was like carpet, if your carpet was damp, vaguely alive, and probably full of uninvited guests like fleas, mice, and other mystery creatures. As for beds, they didn't offer much of a break. Think wooden frame topped with more straw or hay, and that's it. No mattresses, no feather toppers, no pillow top luxury. Just the rustic charm of scratchy straw poking into your back while you try to dream about not freezing to death. Roofs? Ah yes, those charming thatched roofs. They looked quaint in drawings, but in reality, after a few weeks of rain, snow, and wildlife invasions, they sagged, leaked, and occasionally dropped the odd squirrel onto your dinner. You weren't living in a house, you were surviving in a very leaky, hay-scented compromise. And windows? If they existed at all, they were laughably tiny, covered with stretched animal hide or a wooden shutter that barely closed. Natural light? Maybe. Insulation? Not a chance. Glass was so outrageously expensive back then that even the local lord, yes, the guy with the castle and the fancy hat, might have only had a single tiny pane in the whole manor. As for the peasants, they were just hoping the wind didn't rip the cowhide off their window mid-blizzard and send it flying into the next village. Expectations were low. Survival was the goal. And if the walls weren't already doing a poor enough job of keeping the cold out, the floors were more than happy to help it sneak in. You see, the average medieval peasant's floor wasn't made of wood or stone. It was dirt, just plain, compacted earth. And when it rained or snowed, that dirt turned into mud, slowly, from underneath. Congratulations, you now had an unintentional indoor swamp. Real estate listings might have called it a natural water feature, But no one was fooled. In winter, every step across your own floor felt like wading through a half-frozen marsh. Cold from above, cold from below, cold from inside your own walls. It was a full surround sound experience in suffering. But here's the thing. Medieval peasants weren't complainers. They were problem solvers, resourceful, slightly desperate. They stuffed moss into the cracks, jammed cloth into every drafty gap, and huddled together like human space heaters. Insulation? Nah. Just your cousin's body heat, and the faint hope that no one rolled over too far in the night. Sometimes, they'd smear the walls with sheep grease, not for decoration, though who doesn't love a nice greasy sheen, but because it helped seal gaps. It was basically nature's caulk. If you were lucky, your house didn't smell like barnyard despair all the time.